We'll be in Acts chapter 19, picking up in verse 23. About that time, there arose a great disturbance about the way. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in no little business for the craftsmen. He called them together, along with the workmen in related trades, and said, "Men, you know we receive a good income from this business, and you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that man-made gods are no gods at all. There is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty."
Well, thank you, CJ, for that scripture reading. We have here, the CJ just read in Acts chapter 19, the start of what is really a very interesting narrative here in the book of Acts. And I like to make things complicated, so we are actually going to read it out of order here in a little bit, just because I want to. But first I want to rewind, and then we're going to hit the end of the story, and then we'll finish in the middle, because why not? So to rewind, last week, Brady told us a little bit about what he is calling Paul's farewell tour. It is his third missionary journey, and it's a chance that Paul has to go around to different churches that have been planted and connect with other Christians across really across what they would call the world, much of the known world at that time. And this third missionary journey has a large emphasis on the city of Ephesus. A lot of this missionary journey revolves around the city of Ephesus. And so you could kind of see, if you have better eyesight than I do, that Ephesus is kind of in the middle in what we would call the country of Turkey in modern times, but Asia Minor is what they would call it in the Roman Empire. And it was a pretty big cultural hub. Large population, large city. It had importance in not only in Asia Minor, but in the Roman Empire as a whole. And so obviously this was a city that probably the early Christians wanted to focus on, had a large population, and a lot of Christians started to meet here and come together here. I love the way Brady talked about mission work last week, and he used this phrase to describe how Paul's missionary journeys worked, but also how mission work works today, is that when you do missions, you are connecting dots. You are connecting the dots. And another point that he made that I think is probably true is that here in Ephesus, but really all throughout the world, that there were churches cropping up that probably didn't even know about each other. Maybe even in the same city, if the city was large enough, there were groups of believers who had heard the message of the gospel, maybe not from Paul. We know that they probably didn't have a lot of the books of the New Testament we have today written down yet, so probably not from reading something, but from hearing about Jesus word of mouth from other believers. And I think that's an important way that the gospel was spread really early. But as a result of that, it is possible that there were groups of Christians who didn't know about other groups of Christians. And so part of Paul's work was to connect the dots and say, this is what we believe, and I'm going to fill in your knowledge here and fill in the blanks here and come to a full understanding of who Jesus is and who the church is called to be. So this month, we are focused on missions. It is our missions month. And I think in recent years, a lot of people have had a lot of opinions about how missions works, and not everyone has had positive opinions. And I think what you'll often hear is that long-term mission work is super important, and I certainly agree with this, that the work that Keith is doing in Kenya, that he told us about it, has worth, because he has established his work there for years, right? And if you stay with a community over the course of years, you're going to do an important work. But I think a lot of the criticism that I've started hearing about revolves more around what we would call short-term missions, or a short-term mission work. And the way I think of this, even as a youth minister, would just be like what we would call a mission trip, right? This is not my opinion. I think that mission trips are great as long as you come to them with the correct mindset. But the criticism goes something like this, that, you know, if you go to a foreign country and you're there doing mission work for a week, maybe you could argue, how much work are you really doing, right? You're not accomplishing a whole lot during a week. You know, I've even heard stories of you go to a foreign country and you go to an orphanage or whatever kind of organization that you're serving, and maybe you come in and paint the same wall that the church group the week before painted a different color. And some of these stories I think are probably true, right? And it's, you go over to do short-term mission work that's going to make you feel good, but maybe not actually be helping that much. You also hear arguments that, you know, maybe you go on a mission trip to make yourself look good. I think a lot of us have seen that, the social media mission trip where you're taking more pictures and posting more pictures of you playing with the kids, or whatever it may be, to make yourself look good. And I think, you know, that there is some truth that maybe if this is your mindset coming into mission work, then that mindset probably does need to be criticized. But I have nothing against short-term or long-term missions if you're coming in with the mindset of spreading the gospel. Really, what this all boils down to, what this argument is concerned with, is this word that has almost kind of become a bad word in the year 2024, which is this concept of colonization, right? That we, as Americans in a first world country, maybe we go to a third world country and are forcing our values, our way of life upon other people, right? You'll hear this criticism sometimes. And I don't want to get too into the weeds of this. It's a controversial topic, but it does come up this time of year because tomorrow is a major holiday, my birthday, but it is also Columbus Day. And, you know, you hear the arguments on both sides, every which side, that, well, we shouldn't call it Columbus Day because did he even really discover America if people already lived there? Or maybe he was just the first European to discover America, except that's probably not true either. And you have all these arguments back and forth, and there's people who don't even want to call it Columbus Day. And without getting too into the weeds of all of that, I do think, you know, there is probably some wisdom in the thought that if you go to another place and tell them that the way they live their life is wrong, they probably have a right to be offended by that. And I think that we would probably be offended by that if someone said that to us. And so that's not how I want us to think about mission work, but I want us to think about it in a way that my youth minister, when I was growing up, told us. So my first time ever out of the country, I was in Honduras, and we went to the capital, Tegucigalpa, and we had a hotel that we stayed in where we got to meet every night for a Devo up on the rooftop of this hotel, which was a cool experience. It was a really beautiful setting, and we got to just look out over the city. And I think that was a great opportunity for us to see everything that was going on. And instead of coming from a mindset of, we are Americans and we are going to show these people God and show them what to do, I think we had this different mindset. And my youth minister, I'll never forget, he said that when we come here, we are not bringing God with us. God is already here, and we are just coming to see what God is up to in this place. And I think that's so true wherever we go. And we shouldn't be arrogant enough to believe that we are bringing God somewhere that he has not already been. And God is going to be there or God has been there before we were, and he will be there long after we leave. I think that is how we need to think about missions, that we have a privilege to participate in the kingdom of God, which does not have geographical borders. I do now want to skip ahead to the end of the story. So this is Acts chapter 19, 35 through 41. Again, this is the end of this story. So the city clerk quieted the crowd and said, "Fellow Ephesians, doesn't all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of her image, which fell from heaven? Therefore, since these facts are undeniable, you ought to calm down and not do anything rash. You have brought these men here, though they have neither robbed temples nor blasphemed our goddess. If then Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a grievance against anybody, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. They can press charges. If there is anything further you want to bring up, it must be settled in a legal assembly. As it is, we are in danger of being charged with rioting because of what happened here today. In that case, we would not be able to account for this commotion since there was no reason for it." And after he said all this, he dismissed the assembly. Okay, a lot going on here. And again, we skipped ahead, so we don't have all the context yet. But I want to point out something here at the end of this story. So first of all, I do believe that Acts, the whole book, is a fantastic account of the early church. And you get this great image of the church spreading outward. It starts in Jerusalem and moves through Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And you get this image of the church spreading outwards. I do not believe that the book of Acts is written to be like a history textbook. I think it tells us a lot about the history of the church, but I don't think that it's interested in being a history textbook. And this story is an example of why I think that. Here's the deal. Let's think about what this story tells us. It is fascinating to me that 2,000 years later, we are reading a Bible story where a bunch of people got mad and almost had a riot. Right? If it were a history textbook, I think we would be focused on probably something else. This story is interesting, but it might just be a footnote or forgotten because we're talking about the riot that almost happened. So why does this matter? Why is this story included? I think that there must be some theological truth that is revealed here, or we probably wouldn't be as focused on this. So, the city of Ephesus, as we mentioned, is a large cultural population, and the city was very focused on a couple of things, right? One would be their economy, and second might be who they worship. And so we'll get to this here in just a minute. I do want to jump ahead now to the beginning of the story. Jump back to the beginning of the story. So at about that time, there arose a great disturbance about the way. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in a lot of business for the craftsmen there. He called them together along with the workers in related trades and said, "You know, my friends, that we receive a good income from this business. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. There is danger, not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who was worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty." So this is the passage that CJ read for us a few minutes ago, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from this passage. First of all, we learned that this Jesus movement is starting to pick up steam, right? Because large numbers of people are turning away from the worship of the goddess Artemis and are turning toward Jesus. So the Christian mission is successful here. Secondly, we learned that the Christian mission, that this movement is actually having an economic impact in the city. And I think that that's something that's important that we need to notice. So what's obvious here is that Demetrius, who is the spokesman for this silversmithing trade, what's obvious is that he is concerned about the bottom line, that he is worried that if too many people stop worshiping Artemis, that they are going to be out of a job because no one is going to want to buy their idol statues anymore. It's almost funny to us today to hear this argument, but it's something that he was concerned about. I think that is the obvious part of the story. What might not be as obvious is I think there's something else going on here. So yes, he's worried about money, but secondly, if you read the passage, he's also worried about the reputation of the goddess Artemis. And you could read this a couple of different ways. So one, maybe that's religious conviction, right? He is concerned that his religion is becoming obsolete. But I think that there's something deeper going on that we often don't think about in the year 2024, in the 21st century, because it's not something that we have as much familiarity with this concept. So the goddess Artemis was what you would call the patron goddess of the city of Ephesus, the patron goddess. So really, while Demetrius is concerned about money, he's also concerned about his city. You might call it an act of patriotism even, because Artemis is their patron goddess. I'm going to make a really bad analogy, and you have to listen to it anyways. So Artemis is a little bit like the Dallas Cowboys. Almost like a mascot. Artemis is a sense of pride for the entire city. I told you it's a bad analogy. Yes, they worship Artemis, but it's a little bit different. And some people probably worship the Cowboys. When it comes down to it, they don't only love Artemis because it's part of their religion. They love Artemis because they love their city. They're showing pride in the place that they live. Let's keep going here. When they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Soon the whole city was in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and all of them rushed into the theater together. Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, sent him a message begging him not to venture into the theater. The assembly was in confusion. Some were shouting one thing, some another. Most of the people did not even know why they were there. The Jews in the crowd pushed Alexander to the front, and they shouted instructions to him. He motioned for silence in order to make a defense before the people. But when they realized he was a Jew, they all shouted in unison for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So the people take up this rallying cry, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And they are convicted by this statement. And the crowd screams this over and over again until they're blue in the face. They don't even let anyone else talk. And we learn from the passage that a lot of the crowd doesn't even know why they're there to begin with. If we start to understand this rallying cry as something more like a political slogan, then suddenly this looks a lot more familiar to us. The people of Ephesus are upset not because of their religion being threatened. They're upset because their economy, their politics, their religious system, their way of life is being threatened. It is being disrupted. And I think they're probably right to feel this way because the gospel of Christ is disruptive. The gospel of Christ is disruptive. By all accounts, Paul was a fantastic missionary. And just 2 chapters earlier in Acts, we get this wonderful story where Paul is doing mission work in the city of Athens. And in this story, Paul looks around and he sees all of the idols that the Athenians are worshiping. And he sees that they even have an inscription to the unknown God. And Paul takes this opportunity to tell them about this unknown God and to share his faith in God and in Jesus. And I think he's showing a lot of wisdom here, because Paul did not go into Athens and say, no, you're doing everything wrong. None of this makes sense. You're all sinning and evil, and this is all bad. He works within their framework of their own understanding to tell them about Jesus. But here in Ephesus, he stands strong in his convictions, and he tells the Ephesians that any God made by human hands is no God at all, even knowing that statement is going to make them angry and is going to turn them away. So Paul strikes a fantastic balance between what you might call tolerance, but still standing up for his convictions in Christ. And this balancing act represents the same call to missions that I think we as Christians are supposed to have today. That to follow the mission of God, we are called to invite people in right where they're at, but still we don't compromise the message of the gospel, even when it makes people uncomfortable, even when it disrupts our ways of life. In my opinion, one of the best current biblical scholars and theologians you can hear from is N.T. Wright. I've read a lot of his stuff and listened to a lot of things that he said. And something that N.T. Wright says is that God is in the business of bringing things together. God is in the business of bringing things together. And the story of most of the New Testament is the story that God brings together two groups of people, the Jews and the Gentiles, and they have to learn how to become one church made out of two groups of people, which is not lost on me in what our church is doing in the next couple of weeks with the church from Willis. And the story of God throughout the whole Bible is the story of God bringing together heaven and earth which is made possible through the sin, death, and resurrection of Christ, through the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. So instead of believing that heaven is only this far-off place that we have to wait to get to when we die, although I do believe that we have that hope through Christ, we need to believe that the kingdom of heaven is a new reality that is breaking through into our world today. It's invading and colonizing our life here on earth. If we're not ready for what that looks like, for the kingdom of heaven breaking into our world, that is going to look disruptive. We are not going to be used to what that looks like. And growing pains are going to happen. That happens anytime you bring two groups together or two things together. As much as we wish it was, the will of God is not always compatible with our way of life. It's not always compatible with our nation. It's not always compatible with the things that we do. The gospel is disruptive, and therefore the church needs to be disruptive. To be clear, I'm not saying that the church needs to be disruptive because we are stirring up trouble or because we're condemning others. But I believe the church should be disruptive because we bring peace to a world that is full of war, we bring hope to a world that is full of despair, and we bring life to a world that is full of death. And that is what the gospel is about. Jesus' death on the cross was the most disruptive event in all of history, and I don't think that's such a bad thing. Jesus disrupts the power of sin and death, and he allows us to no longer be in slavery to those things. Some of us here this morning, we need disruption. We need the disruption of Jesus. And we need that to not only work outwards, but we need to turn it inwards, and some of our hearts need to be disrupted, the things that we're enslaved to. We have that gift, we have that power through baptism. And that's something that we can offer today. If you need that disruptive power of the gospel, we are ready to offer that. And we invite you to come forward as we stand and sing.